All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the October monthly chapter meeting of the Association of IT Professionals, North Central Florida. I'm your host, Don Pizzette, president of local chapter. I want to officially welcome you. For everybody who is remote out there on YouTube Live, as well as everybody who's here in the studio with us, thank you for coming out and being a part of the AITP. It's a great opportunity to network with other professionals in the IT field, as well as hopefully learn something new and again, further advance the world of IT. That's kind of our goal. Now, I want to just do a couple of messages here before we get into our talk about Wes Bryan here is going to do a great presentation for us today. But before we tackle that, just a couple of things. If you're new to the AITP, it's a wonderful organization. You should definitely learn more about it. Jump over to our website, aitp-ncfl.org, and you can learn more about our local chapter as well as the national organization, which is now a part of CompTIA. So the CompTIA Pro or AITP Association, it's all the same thing. You get two names for the price of one, which is great. So, that's something you want to learn about. Also, you are always more than welcome to come and join us here in person. Coming into the location for a chapter meeting, either ours or one of the others across the nation, is a great way to meet other IT professionals, network, learn a little bit more. We've been sharing stories for about an hour now about all sorts of different things. So it's a lot of fun. You should definitely check out your local chapter, preferably ours. If you're in the area, we'd love to have you here. Speaking of participation, it is that time of year again. It's election time, and I'm not talking about the national elections. I'm talking about AITP elections. There are a number of members here in our chapter that graciously give away their free time, or at least some of their free time, every single month to help continue the operations of this chapter. And these are people with titled positions like president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, as well as our directors, which are all people that help to steer the direction of this chapter. Now, if that sounds exciting and fun to you, well, it is most times, and it is something that you can actually participate in if you're interested. We are opening the floor for nominations. If you want to nominate someone or even nominate yourself to participate in the board of our local chapter, now is the time to do it. An email is either, help me out, Stephen, has the email already gone out?
No, it hasn't yet.
Okay, so an email will be going out shortly if you're on our mailing list, but if not, you can always reach out to any of us here at the local chapter and again, nominate yourself. If you want to take a titled position like secretary, president, vice president, it's a nomination. We do an election, so we're opening up our nominations right now. Our goal is to close the nominations at the end of October and then do our actual election on November 5th. So very, very similar to our national system.
That's right.
So that's our goal there. So definitely put your name in the hat. Right now we have a number of board members like Mr. Wes Bryan and myself who are willing to return in our positions, but it is an election. So if you want a chance to jump in there, we absolutely want to do that. We have, I mentioned the titles already, president, secretary, treasurer, and vice president. But we also have directors, and we're supposed to have one director for every 10 members. And so right now we should have at least 5 directors, and we have 3, right? So we really need to have some more. So if you want to do that, please let us know. We'll get your name on that ballot. Keep an eye out on your email. Those will be going out soon. All right, well, I have talked a good bit about the chapter, but let's talk about something that's going to be way more interesting, which is what Mr. Wes Bryan is here to do for us today. Wes is an edutainer at IT Pro TV who has done an amazing presentation on the end of life of Windows 7. I know I've heard about it in the news. Most people have, being one of the most popular operating systems in the world. It's something you want to know about. Wes, thank you for coming and talking to us.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. It's great to be here with the people that are here in person and the people that are here online, too.
All right, well, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Keep in mind, if you have any questions for you guys here in the studio with us, we're going to do a Q&A session at the end. I'll go around with a microphone so you can ask your questions. If you're out there in YouTube land, we actually have the chat room up here on a screen in front of us, so just throw your messages in there, and we'll tackle them at the end of the presentation. So, Wes?
All right. Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody in the North Florida AITP. I better get our name right. And it's wonderful to be here. And, this might be something that you've heard about. The fact that January 14th of 2020, I love how it is actually the day of my birthday that Windows 7 is going to come to its end of life. Please don't blame me for that. I really had nothing to do with it ahead of time, but it's one of these things that's very, very, important to get prepared for. And we would hope that you haven't just waited till, well, we're in October here. We only got a couple more months until it hits its end of life, that you haven't waited until now to try to determine what it is that you're going to do when, like Don said, you heard him say that it's the most popular operating system since XP. And this isn't really something that's new. We've seen this before. In fact, in the past, when I first started working in computers and stuff, back when I was getting my very first certification, past CompTIA was a series of MCTSs. So I had the pleasure of learning about computers when it was the days of Vista. So boy, did I hear all the complaints about why would you even be wanting to learn about Vista, because everybody knew that XP had been around. I believe it was in 2001 that it had been released, and it was supported for 10 years, and it also went into an extended support cycle, and I believe it was April of 2014, where we officially seen the end. So it's going to be important. What I'd like to do is just really talk a little bit about end of life and what it means for an operating system, and then some of the options that you have for your companies and your businesses when it comes to, well, what should we do? Can we continue to run Windows 7? Is that going to be a problem in our in our industry, or maybe in your business? And the answer is most likely it will be. So let's go ahead and dive right in. One of the first things that you might see is something like this, and this is the little nag screen that comes up in Windows 7 if you still have Windows 7 today, and they're letting you know if after 10 years of support, Windows 7 is coming to an end, there comes a time when even the most popular software, doesn't matter how much we appreciate it, how much we like it, it has to be let go. And we have to, just focus on, the current operating systems that we have. And Windows 7 is really not going to be any exception to this rule. It's going to set sail with its one-way ticket off into electrical limbo. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that the operating system is going to cease to function on January 2020, but what is going to happen is that security updates, these things that keep our operating system safe and patched inside of systems, is going to stop. So that is one of the things to keep in mind. And believe it or not, there are still a lot of people in the industry using Windows 7, much like they were back in the days when XP hit its end of life and we needed to move on to something newer. And, well, in those days it was Windows Vista. And it's been a great operating system. I don't know about you, but for one, I absolutely love this operating system, and I'm sad to see it go. So today we'll just discuss a little bit about, what does end of life mean in general? What are the risks of using something like Windows 7 after it hits EOL, acronym soup, end of life there, and then what are the options that businesses have? So one of the things that I thought was interesting when we were having this discussion in IT Pro TV is we actually went out to one of our social media sites. You might have heard of it before. We don't own it, Facebook, though, on our IT Pro TV page, and we actually took some of the comments because, you always want to hear, well, what are they saying, the they, right? What do you hear in the news? Well, these are actually some people right here that, they're commenting because it's directly affecting them. Now, I can tell you the person in the top of the list is the shining star of IT. I don't know how consistent this is across the board, but Barrett out there says, I don't run software past its end of support date. You can see some other people here talking about Windows 7 should have never been put to rest. It's been one of the best operating systems, and that's a lot what we heard back when XP moved, when we moved out of using XP and into the days of Vista. Same thing here, too short of a lifetime, for the greatest operating systems Windows has ever had. And the last two I really think are interesting because some people might not understand that Windows 10 doesn't require more horsepower than Windows 7. So I put these in here in the list just to maybe help clarify. One of the comments, the person says, I don't even know if my my hardware, I should say, is going to have the horsepower to run Windows 10. Well, I can tell you out there, Les, yes, it will, because one of the things that's great, if you are considering moving to Windows 10, and hey, do we have to buy all new hardware? Well, again, that's going to depend on the current hardware that you have. But if you can meet the minimum requirements for Windows 7, you can run Windows 10. So do keep that in mind as well. And then the last one here I thought is interesting as well, because Alan says, I thought Windows 7 support ended years ago. Well, one of the things I'd like to kind of just say a little bit about is that Windows life cycle. And Alan would be right if he was talking about mainstream support. See, we have our three major Windows versions that are supported here, and you can see that Windows 7 started way back. It was released in October 22nd of 2009, and here we are into it's 2020 when it hits the end of life cycle. And you can see Windows 8 or 8.1 and more correctly today, and it also has a 10-year life cycle. And then likewise, we see Windows 10 today. Well, what does this actually mean? If we look at the green is what's known as mainstream support. And mainstream support, this is when we get, for instance, new features, additional driver support, if you will, as new hardware comes out. So we get we get the security updates, non-security updates, and that's really the mainstream support. So when Alan said, I thought support stopped years ago, well, it depends. Which phase of that life cycle you're talking about, because in 2015, the mainstream support ended, and we've actually been in for the last 5 years what's known as extended support for Windows 7. And the same thing really goes with Windows 8.1. Now, when we talk about extended support, what does really extended support mean? Well, extended support, this is when they're going to stop doing non-security updates. You're not going to get the additional features, new software, if you will, and you're certainly not going to get additional driver support for hardware that's coming out, because they like to take those resources and focus it on the new and latest, greatest operating system that's running. So the extended support is what you see is actually coming to the end. And it's interesting because it's important now, because now we go into a phase where we're no longer getting those critical security updates. And that's really what end of life means for us. We're running, we have the potential past January 14th of 2020 to be running unpatched systems within your environments, within your work environment, And what I'd like to just mention, why is that so important? Well, let's just take a look here. This is off of Microsoft's, you might have heard about this before. This is the Microsoft Security Research Center, and they're really the ones that do a lot of the work with other security researchers out there, and they come up with and deem what is a critical update and what must be patched. And this just happens to be one, and it's not really important on the text, but what's really important, the fact that the date here is just a few months ago. And they found a remote code exploitation inside of the Windows subsystem where somebody could craft a generic malformed packet and actually start a man-in-the-middle a remote code exploitation inside of Windows. Well, the big thing about this here is if we look, we'll see that, the first two patches up here, we're going to try to do this here. It might not work so much, but the first two entries up here are Windows 7. So you can see that when critical patches stop, so do things like this. So does the support here that we see inside of the operating system in Windows. We don't have that support. So keep that in mind, that when your end of life happens, no longer do you have access to these type of security fixes. And that's important to keep in mind because, we hear a lot of people say, well, I'm in the home environment. That really doesn't affect me that much. Well, that could be the case if you're only in a home environment, but what if you bring your home computer and maybe connect it to a network? Whether you can do that or not is really up to your company's security policy. But the other thing to keep in mind too is, what if your company is under some kind of regulatory compliance? When 2020 or January 14th, 2020 happens, if you still got Windows 7 machines within your networks, now you are no longer patched, and you're most likely going to be out of compliance. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons too, to get these security fixes, because another little interesting thing is, anybody remember this little virus here, this little ransomware virus called WannaCry? Well, WannaCry, believe it or not, it so rapidly affected machines, and it happened quickly. One of the things that we found out, according to Kaspersky, was that when it comes to the WannaCry virus, 98% of all computers, I think there was 400,000 or 500,000 computers infected really, really quickly. Out of 98% of all of the computers infected were running some form of Windows 7. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, and you can't even see it, even if I was to kind of zoom into it, you can't even see a bar graph or a bar here in this graph on Windows 10 machines. Windows 10 machines were relatively unaffected. Now I don't know if that's just because of the market saturation of Windows 10 versus Windows 7, but if you think about it, if 98% of all computers, Windows computers that are infected by WannaCry are running Windows 7, then we have a big problem still. And here's the reason we've got a problem. One of the problems we have is, this is a net market share, and net market share, you can see over here on the right-hand side, they've got a little graph that lets us know that, the majority of our Windows machines today are Windows 10 machines, around 52%, 53%, but 28% of the machines that are running Windows are still running Windows 7. Now, that's interesting because when we talk about 28%, if you think, I think some of the numbers are around 1 billion copies distributed worldwide. All right, I'm no good at math, so 1 billion, if we've got 28%, that means we still have around 280 million devices out there that are running Windows 7. Now, if you couple that back with Kaspersky, and Kaspersky saying that 98% of all machines that were infected by WannaCry were affected by Windows 7, that means over 200 or around 280 million devices could potentially be infected. Now, I just want to also make mention of something here. When we talk about, something like WannaCry, we talk about that remote code exploitation that I just showed you briefly with the Microsoft Security Research Center. These were Windows 7 machines that were being actively patched by Microsoft. They're in the extended support lifecycle. All right, critical updates are researched, if you will, and then thrown on the legendary Patch Tuesday. If Microsoft, when they're actively patching the Windows 7 operating system, can still be infected so much when they're doing security updates, how much more crucial is it when they stop doing these critical updates? So again, just with that 28% market share, anywhere from 280 to 300 million users, this becomes a very big deal very quickly. It could be just a simple machine that's brought from the home, placed within your networks, and now you've got an unpatched system within your networks. It runs wild, and if the infection rate is as fast as it is with something like WannaCry, your whole entire network can be affected really, really quick. So when we look at, what options do businesses have today? Well, we've got a couple of options one option that we'll talk about towards the end here, and that's the one that's extended security updates. And you're going to hear me mention that. You might hear me mention the acronym. In IT, I'm really convinced that we can't speak unless we speak in acronyms, but that's the ESU, if you will, and we'll leave that one for last because the two main type of options that we've had in the past have been upgrades or migrations. And that's really kind of what I want to focus on is the upgrade and the migration. Now, there are other options too out there that can help to assist this, but when we talk about upgrades, all right, the upgrading from an unsupported version of Windows, or if you're doing it according to best practices, while it's still supported, you upgrade to the supported operating system, the future operating system. This is one of the options that businesses have when they maybe want to keep all of their users' data, they want to keep the file system settings, and all of the applications. When we do these kind of upgrades, we can retain that information, and that might be something that a business wants to do, especially, or if they have just maybe 5 to 10 type of Windows 7 to Windows 10 deployments that they have to do. Now, on a larger scale, you can also do migrations. Now, if you are going to consider doing an upgrade, you have to do a little bit of research. We have to find out, I have a Windows 7 operating system, and I've already been asked some questions before. If I've got a Windows 7 operating system, can I upgrade to Windows 10? Well, I'm not sure. You have to do your research because there are certain editions that you can upgrade from and to, but then there are certain limitations. This is something that a company can do in a smaller environment or setting. Again, I wouldn't say, and I'm pretty sure Microsoft says that anything past 10 upgrades that you have to do, you want to move to more scalable platforms, and that's where the second option typically comes in. With the second option, migrations, what we do is we typically add another option and a lot more infrastructure, but one of those options are we have hundreds, thousands, maybe 5,000 computers that we need to save and retain the user settings. Then for these large deployments, more complex and custom type installations, then the upgrade might not be your option. This it allows you to utilize more enterprise level technologies. Now, some of these technologies, I have to tell you, Microsoft has already changed some of these names, and this presentation is only a couple of weeks old, believe it or not. So we have traditional technologies like the Microsoft Deployment Kit, a toolkit, if you will, MDT, as well as one of the earlier ones, and it's still out there, but that was the Windows ADK and the Assessment and Deployment Kit. And the Assessment and Deployment Kit's a really good thing because it bundles in some of these other utilities like the User State Migration tool. Now, when I say you're going to do something like a migration, you're going to leverage these enterprise level technologies. When you use something like the User State Migration tool, then what you can do is you can basically retain all of the user settings, the Windows settings, and sometimes some of the application settings if they're specific to Microsoft installations. And then what you can do, or Microsoft like Office Suite products, you can put those in a centralized repository, and you can essentially automate your migration from the Windows 7 to the Windows 10 machines. The other thing, you get utilities too, like for instance, you have the application compatibility toolkit because there might be applications that aren't supported by Windows 10. So when we say that you do an upgrade and you can retain those applications, if that application isn't supported in Windows 10, then you might need to use something like an application compatibility toolkit. Now, I included the ACT because some of you might be familiar with this, but that functionality is kind of being deprecated away. And in Windows 10, it's actually brought into Windows Analytics, and you're going to love this because now Windows Analytics has changed to Desktop Analytics. So they're doing a lot of shifting of the names here, but all of that functionality is brought into these enterprise level technologies that allow you to migrate your operating system from the older unsupported operating system to a newer operating system in a centralized and more strategic fashion than just going from computer to computer to computer like we would do in some of the old days with an optical disc, if we even use optical discs anymore. And using something like the compatibility migration or the compatibility toolkit, or more appropriately today, Windows Analytics, you have other technologies in there, like for instance the Windows Upgrade Readiness Toolkit, and that's a really cool toolkit because what it allows you to do is not only analyze your entire Windows infrastructure and finding out if these devices will support the migration to the newer operating system, but they actually bring in the functionality of the Application Compatibility Toolkit, and they can analyze your applications as well and give you a centralized report, if you will, a dashboard that you can view, and you can make some sense out of the information that you're seeing, and they give you different ratings on it as well. So this is one of the other options that you have, and traditionally these have been the two options that we have. And again, we'll talk about the extended security updates here in just a second. But I would ask you, is this really what Microsoft recommends today? And the answer is, well, they've got a couple other things in mind. And these are the three that they really talk about when they say, when you ask, what does Microsoft recommend? And you can get some good documentation up on Microsoft's website. Just look for Windows 7 end-of-life best practices, and they're going to tell you what it is that they recommend. And they recommend these three: the shift to Microsoft 365, as well as the Windows Virtual Desktop. More appropriately, it should be called Windows Virtual Desktop and Azure. For those of you that have maybe been familiar with like Virtual PC and stuff, this isn't Virtual PC. It should say Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure. And then again, last but not least, that pesky little acronym there, the Extended Security Update Plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, what that actually means. So when we look at the very first one, again, you're going to see a little bit of a name change here. Notice that one of the things that we mentioned here is Office 365. Well, it is no longer called Office 365, and it is being branded into Microsoft 365. And let me just take a second here to just, again, not to be a spokesman for Microsoft, but Office 365 was very good in managing the line of business applications in the Office suite, but they've now brought in Windows 10 features that you can virtualize your desktop and have centralized management of your Windows 10 virtual desktop infrastructure in this Microsoft 365, as well as offering you enterprise-level mobility and security technology. So it's not really just the Office suite anymore. However, kind of an older logo. I kind of consider this the cloud version of upgrading, if you will. Because what it allows you to do is take your Windows 10 machines and you can actually virtualize and upgrade them to the cloud to Windows 10 and then just manage Windows 10 infrastructure. And you get the ability to use some more of these enterprise level technologies. Like, for instance, you can use the Windows Autopilot feature. And Windows Autopilot's actually really cool, where you might not even have an operating system on your machine. You might have a bare metal, and your IT person says, okay, boot this machine up, and it connects to the cloud and pulls down your operating system. So that's kind of really cool. In-place upgrades you can also do. And the other thing that's really cool about leveraging Microsoft 365 is you get this blending and being able to bring in technologies like Microsoft's Intune, as well as things like System Center Configuration Manager, if you're doing more of the hybrid type environment, which is the on-premise environment connecting to the cloud, which Microsoft really doesn't seem to like the hybrid term anymore. They call it co-management today. But you also get these kind of advantages as well. So I kind of consider this as like the cloud version of upgrading. You're not keeping on to Windows 7, but what you're doing is you're basically moving into the cloud and deploying Windows 10 in the cloud. Now, not every company, just like we've seen going back to the days of XP, not every company is going to be able to say, that's it, throw in the towel, no more Windows 7, especially if you've got line of business applications that require a Windows 7 environment. And that's where the next one, did I go the wrong way? We might have two slides here. Looks like I did. Give me 1 second here. It looks like I missed one. Okay, I don't know where that other slide went, but
Lost it in your upgrade.
I lost it in my upgrade. That's what I shouldn't do. So I'm going to talk about the Windows Azure one, apparently without a slide here. The Windows Virtual Desktop with on Azure. This is a great way because not every company gets the ability to just throw in the towel on Windows 7 and go to Windows 10. So Microsoft has tried to make it a little bit easier for companies that need a little bit more of a transition time. What they can do is they can take their Windows 7 infrastructure and they can virtualize it in the Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure. Now, one of the benefits of doing that, if you talk about, you get the cloud-based virtualization, one of the benefits that you get when you virtualize your Windows 7 operating system up on the Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure is you get free security updates. And that's something that might be beneficial. Some of the things that we're going to talk about, the paid service of extended security updates is not something that you have to have when you use the Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure. That actually becomes bundled into it. So it is a really, really good thing if you need a little bit more time in your transition from the Windows 7 to the Windows 10 operating system. Now, that brings me, provided my slides didn't go through the upgrade, to what is known as the Windows 7 Extended Security Updates. Now, what is the Windows 7 Extended Security Updates? All right. Keep in mind that these, with the options prior, whether it is moving to Windows 10 via an on-premise upgrade or migration, or moving to Windows 10 via 365, or just virtualizing Windows 7 to Windows Virtual Desktop, you'll get the updates and you'll have an updated operating system. But even at that, what are the Windows 7 Extended Security Updates? Well, it's a way to keep updated out to as far as 2023. It's a paid service. This is pay for play when we get into the extended security updates. It's actually had an availability that's been around for a while, and without going into too many of the technicalities behind it, basically you could license what's known as a multiple activation key, and you could associate that to your volume licensing inside of your enterprise level environment. And they wanted people to be ready for this transition, so they actually started allowing that as far back as April. It is on a per device basis. Keep that in mind. If you've got 500 devices that are running Windows 7 and you want extended support, you will have 500 individual devices that you have to pay for. If you have 5,000, you will have 5,000 individual devices that you have to pay for. I'm not exactly sure on the pricing right now. I've heard something as simple as $25 per device, but then it doubles in the second year and it triples in the third year. So it'll get very, very expensive very quick. There isn't a minimum purchase for this, but it is edition specific. You have to have Windows 7 Professional, or you have to have Windows 7 Enterprise. Now, Windows 7 Enterprise has also always been volume licensed, so that's not an RTM or a release to market type of edition. You have to go to Microsoft and get those, but many people have bought Windows 7 Professional off of the shelf and installed that on their operating system. So, and next, it leads me into what's known as the Microsoft's Windows 7 ESU promotion. All right. Now, if you have an E5 license already active in Azure or Microsoft 365 E5, I believe there's a Windows E5, and there's one other one, and I'm not sure off the top of my head which one that is, but they're all E5 licensing. And if you have E5 licensing within your cloud-based subscription, then Microsoft is going to provide you free, no charge, 1 year of Windows 7 extended security updates. Again, there are some subscription-specific requirements, and there is a time-sensitive deadline. You have to enroll in this by December 31st or 2019, or you will not qualify for it. So they want everybody by the end of this year, if you have these E5 instances in the cloud, that you go ahead and get on board with this before the end of the year. All right, so how can we actually deploy these extended security updates? All right, well, with the extended security updates, we can deploy these just like we've really been deploying the majority of our updates through, years past. You can do this via Windows Update. You can do this via Windows Update for Business, as well as System Center Configuration Manager, and last but of course not least, the Windows Server Update service. And I did have a question that came in that said, how is it going to know that we've paid for our subscription? And that's where that multiple activation key comes in. If you are a volume licensed subscriber, it doesn't conflict with any other MAC key that you have, but it's used in association with this. And even if it's been associated with like a Windows 7 machine that is not going to a centralized update repository like Windows Server Update Service, when it reaches out to Microsoft's Windows Update servers, it will pull down the updates when it sees the association with that MAC key. So deployment of these extended security updates should be relatively easy. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So just in summary, one of the things that I would mention is that, remember, Windows 7 has a very large user base. We're seeing still hundreds of millions of users that are using it. And while the home users might not think that it directly affects them, what we do in the enterprise, remember that ransomware spreads, and it doesn't say, oh, well, you're a home user and you're not a home user, you're an enterprise user, so I'll leave you alone. So we do have to keep in mind that it presents a major security risk. We have our options. We can upgrade or we can migrate to Windows 10. Keep in mind that some of the traditional ways that we've done our upgrades and migrations aren't necessarily what Microsoft's recommending. They're definitely pushing the cloud today. They want you to move to Microsoft 365. If you need a little bit more transition time, you can always move to the Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure. And then last but not least, again, truly last but not least, is to, well, I guess you just have to get out your wallet and purchase one of those Windows 7 ESU subscriptions.
All right, Wes, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. I'd like to give you a round of applause. Thank you for that.
I do have one update. My slides updated for me. Let me give you the promotion licenses that you would need. It's Windows E5, Microsoft 365 E5, Microsoft 365 Security E5, and then the Microsoft VDA E5. So if any of you have those out there, you will receive that 1 year of free ESUs.
All right, so the secret is look for that E5 in the license.
That's right.
Otherwise, we get lost in acronym soup.
And that's right, you do.
All right, well, I said I wanted to open up the floor for a Q&A session here at the end, so let's go ahead and do that. If you're watching on YouTube Live, just type your question right there in the chat room. But if you're here in studio, just raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone around, and we can answer some questions. So anybody have any questions on Windows 7 End of Life? All right.
Wes, for a small business, somebody who isn't particularly sophisticated, or for just a person who has a PC in their home, what do you think is the easiest way to handle this situation? Would it be to get the ESU and just pay for additional until you can handle it, an actual new machine, or what would you recommend?
My first thought was how invested are you in the Windows 7 other than emotionally? Because a lot of people have an emotional attachment to it. Information in front of me to completely confirm this is that it's double the cost that what it is for enterprise. So if somebody isn't a home user license, they're going to pay $50 for the first year. They're going to pay $100 for the second, and they're going to pay, I want to say, $300 for the third. So when you look at the price, the overall price of a Windows 10 operating system, if you don't have anything heavily invested, if you've got a line of business software that you've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for, you might want to stay. But if you're a home user, I would just say upgrade. That would be my recommendation, is just to upgrade.
And Wes, has it been your experience that, like, for home users, a lot of times they upgrade by buying a new computer, right? So it's not like they intentionally say, I'm going to upgrade this machine to Windows 10. It's just, hey, I bought a new laptop and it happens to have Windows 10?
Yeah, they do. Microsoft has made it a little bit easier with Windows 10 to upgrade. So you can do the electronic software distribution, where if you do have your machine, they have the TPL, the Trusted Product List, where a lot of vendors get in there and they tell you what's supported by Windows 10. And if you know you have hardware within your system, not only meeting the minimum requirements, but you can go and you can plug that information in and search by vendor based on what's in your hardware to see if it's going to be supported on the Windows 10. And if it is, then you can go to Microsoft and you can buy it right offline and download it, just like you would, like we do with our ISO files here as well. But for the most part, yeah, a lot of people just get a new laptop, get a new device within their system.
My question is not necessarily about Windows 7, but one of the functions, Microsoft introduced home group networking with Vista, and then they really pushed it with Windows 7. And then my understanding is it's no longer supported.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, that's
I mean,
right.
Now I've got like a couple people that I assist that's one of the reasons why they're in Windows 7 land, is because they've settled on a home group network strategy. So what's your recommendation on upgrading through that mess, so to speak?
As far as I know right now, I'm not aware of the any kind of home group functionality, so I really can't speak to that. I know home group, a lot of people liked it, just like people liked Media Center, and some people liked Media Center and it went by the wayside. So I'm not exactly sure. I know that today we use things like file history, and when they really push things like OneDrive, because you can synchronize information to OneDrive and have somebody connect to it and pull that information down across multiple devices. However, it is account specific. So as far as the sharing aspect of that, two people would have to have their own like OneDrive account. So they're really pushing things, as far as that goes, to the cloud.
And I think I can maybe add just a little bit more to that, because Microsoft's not only pushing OneDrive, they're pushing all their cloud stuff. Like when you install Windows 10 in the latest version, they make you use an online account. So just doing a local account is not really an option for home editions. So they're really pushing it hard on the home side. And then home groups, Wes, correct me if I'm wrong, did home groups ever work like in a domain? They didn't work alongside a domain,
No.
Right?
It was based on the network location of the firewall, and if you put it into the work or business, work or domain firewall profile, it disabled home group. And in the enterprise editions, you could see a home group, you could join it, but you couldn't create one. So they already had limitations to what you could do inside of a corporate environment. And we've seen this before. It's one of the reasons Media Center wasn't in enterprise level editions, because they didn't figure people would be coming to work, using Media Center. So it had reduced or limited functionality for the professional and more specifically the enterprise level versions.
All right, got another question here in the studio.
Wes, we've talked about the operating system. What about things like Microsoft Office and all those applications like Excel and Word, Outlook itself? Does the migration or the movement from Windows 7 to Windows 10 include that? Or is that something that has to be handled separately?
Yeah, you're like. Well, if you retain the software, I don't know about typically you're going to have to pay for another Office SKU. And I know that they're really pushing the individual subscription-based model of Office in the cloud, Office 365, even though it's kind of Microsoft 365 now.
All right, there was a question that came in via YouTube
Yep, and
about
I've seen that too.
Windows 7 in a virtual machine. So if I have an application that requires Windows 7, but I've upgraded to Windows 10, and I know an option that I have is I could build up a virtual machine with Windows 7, is that virtual machine safe, or do I have to worry about its security too?
Well, a virtual machine is going to be just as secure as the host that it's running on. And another thing to keep in mind too is that if you give the host machine that your Windows Virtual 7 machine, I'll get it right again, Windows 7 virtual machine, if you give it access to the host machine, you open that pipeline that anything that the Windows 7 machine is vulnerable to, the host is going to be vulnerable to as well. And that's really what we see across the board with virtualization. Once you open that communication between the virtual machine and the host that it's running on, anything that infects the host can infect the virtual machine, and likewise the reverse of that as well. So you definitely have to make sure that any kind of the security hardening techniques that you would implement on a physical machine, you always want to implement in a virtualized environment as well. Because really the only thing that's separating you from getting that infection between the virtual machine and the host is that pipeline. And if you break that, well, unfortunately, you're no longer isolated, and all those vulnerabilities apply.
I know I had a conversation last month with one of the security instructors over at IT Pro TV, and he was telling me how in most virtualization systems, they make it where guest operating systems have like shared folder access with the host. And he was telling me about how ransomware loves the shared folder access. Like it might not be able to get root access to the underlying machine, but it can sure encrypt stuff.
And that's and I'm sure you could probably speak a little to this too. The WannaCry virus was an exploit in the SMB protocol, the server message block protocol that's used for sharing resources within Windows-based networks. So if you open that communication again across the network between Windows 7 machines and the host that they're running on, then you could potentially open and expose the vulnerability, just to either machine.
All right, well, Wes, I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and not just what all the acronyms stand for. Windows 7 is such a widely deployed operating system; it's on everybody's radar, and if it isn't, it should be. Obviously, Microsoft's making that big push to migrate. So, thank you for coming out and presenting to the chapter.
Hope you guys enjoyed it.
We really appreciate it. Yeah. All right. Well, for everybody out there in TV land and for everybody here in the studio, Wes will be around here for a few more minutes. We can kind of hobnob and bump elbows and all that. But I do want to do a quick reminder for everybody about how chapter meetings like this are probably the greatest benefit of being a part of AITP, that you are always welcome to come out and attend our chapter meetings. If you are a member, if you're not a member, if you're a guest, whatever, just walk in the door. We don't turn people away. Come on in. It's a great chance to introduce yourself to some people in the community, learn a little bit more about what's going on in the world of IT, and hear phenomenal presentations like Wes's. So definitely look to do that. And if you're interested in serving on the board for our local chapter, we're always looking for new people to jump in and help out. So please become a part of that process as well. Go to our website, AITP-NCFL.org. You can learn more about it and find our contact information on there and reach out to see about becoming a member of our chapter. All right, well, ladies and gents, I think this is a good spot for us to wrap up our chapter meeting. Do remember to keep an eye out on the emails because the elections are going to be occurring. And then our next chapter meeting, I should have written this one down. Is our next chapter meeting November 5th?
November 5th.
Okay, November 5th is our next chapter meeting. Thank you, Stephen. And so, we'll look forward to having everybody here. It's getting close to the holiday season, so we'll turn things a little bit more fun. And, we always have fun here, whether it's the holidays or not.
That's right.
All right, everybody. Well, signing off for AITP, I've been your host, Don Pizzette, with guest speaker Wes Bryan. Thank you, and thank you to everybody in the studio, and we will see you next month.
Take care. All right.